Well, it's a real pleasure to have John Gartner here today. He's in Perth, an old soldier from Australia um, who's done a lot in his life. He's written recently written and published a book called The Fading Light, which John might talk about a bit later. But John came to Rhodesia in 1974, I think,
That's correct. Yep.
out of the Australian SAS. But John, you tell us a little bit about your background and what caught your eye and why did you come to Rhodesia in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Hannes. Good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Really have been watching the previous editions of this, and they've all been very interesting, and it brings back a lot of memories. So I really do appreciate the invitation,
Thanks.
and thanks to Rich Stannard for routing it through to me. So that's good. So
Nice to have
yeah,
you.
look, old soldier now, of course. Still think of myself as a soldier. I'm in the security industry and coming up to 70 next birthday, but still working in the industry, security particularly, and the paramilitary sort of commercial side of it. But came from Adelaide, poor boy, wrong side of the tracks. Not many opportunities in my world in the 50s and 60s when I was growing up, and I had two grandfathers who both served in the military in the First World War. So I had a little bit of a guiding light in that they were military people. And I guess as I hit my teen years, I had an interest in going into the military and being, as I said, from a lower socio-economic background in Adelaide, there weren't many opportunities for me, and the military was a great opportunity. And I went into the army in 71, the intention, being very naive at 19, 18, 19 when I was determining to go in, and 19 when I actually enlisted. And I had a pretty naive sort of understanding of what war was and where it would lead me. But Vietnam was in full swing. The Australian Army was deployed there. And I guess at 19, when I did my recruit training, a lot of young, naive, young men around me, a bit unaware of what war actually presented, and we were all pretty keen to do our part and go off to Vietnam. And recruit training, and by my selection of going to infantry, I wanted to go to infantry. Others went to other artillery, armor, and so forth, but infantry was my choice, and I went off to do a further 3 months of infantry training. And during that, I actually sort of was presented with the opportunity to undertake the SAS selection in Western Australia, which is not far from where I live now, actually. So 71, I put my hand up and I was selected, and I was fit and healthy, and I came across to Perth, and a few months after I arrived here, I started the selection in I guess the third quarter of 71, and with about 120 other students or selectees, people who are keen to get in the unit. Pretty tough selection, as you can imagine, 8 weeks, pretty much no respite throughout, conducted in 3 or 4 phases. And I was fortunate enough to watch a lot of the older guys fall by the wayside as we sort of went through that selection. And at the end, I think there were less than 20 of us standing when we, at the end of the selection, and there I was, 71, 19 years of age, and had passed the SAS selection course. So to my great pride, which I still retain that pride to this day, of course, an accomplishment at that time, and something really I never expected when I enlisted in the army. I'd never even heard of the SAS those days, So doing the para course that year as well, and finished off the year 71, and came back to Perth, and there I was, a member of the SAS, posted to 1 squadron, and I asked for C Troop, which was mobility. They were starting up new disciplines, new approaches, new strategies and tactics, vehicle mounted, and we spent a fair bit of time up in the northwest of Australia, which was far less developed than it is now. So that was my entree into the military. Was within the first year I'd done my recruit training, my infantry training, undertaken and completed a selection, and finished the para course. So quite an eventful 1971, and I turned 20 at the end of that year. And there I was in the SAS in 72, 73. So, it was something I enjoyed, but young, and one of the things I had my head set on was going to Vietnam. But during my own selection in late 71, the Australian SAS was recalled from Vietnam. 2 squadron returned to Australia, I think in October 71, and was disbanded. It was an early return from Vietnam. I think they had done 9 months or so. And because there were insufficient numbers within that squadron, the squadron was disbanded, and those who stayed in the army were split between 1 and 3 squadrons. And there was my sort of combat or my hopeful combat experience flown out the door. So I was quite disappointed and sort of didn't really know what I was going to do. And of course, you know, into 72, 73 during the training and building a career within SAS, I was sort of not discontent. I was quite happy, but I just felt that, you know, I didn't want to be a peacetime soldier, and that there were probably more exciting things to do. And while I was young, I wanted to try those and test myself. But during the course of the period I served in the Australian SAS, I was looking around, and in late 73, Rhodesia popped up on the radar within the SAS. Quite a number of guys there all of a sudden started talking about Rhodesia was offering contracts to former Australian SAS. I think Nick Lompracht had been out from Salisbury doing the rounds very discreetly, of course, because of the sanctions era. But Nick had been sort of spreading the word, and the word had gotten around to SAS, and a number of guys were putting up their hand to go. And essentially, that's what I did. I sent late 73 as my 3-year first initial engagement went to an end. I sent off my application to Salisbury, KG6 barracks, and quickly got a response and was offered a chance to undertake the C Squadron selection in 74 when I finished my service in Australia. So I took discharge, and in February 74, at the end of my 3-year engagement, and in March I was on the plane coming up to Salisbury, and the rest is history.
What were your first impressions of the country? It must have been quite a shock arriving in a...
Well, I mean, if we look now, Australia is a very developed cosmopolitan country, but in 73, 74, we were still, I mean, Perth itself was pretty much like a sleepy country town. You know, it's a city now, it's thriving, but in 73, 74, it was quite small. So I can't say I was coming from a sophisticated environment a la New York or London or something to Central Africa. But when I arrived in Salisbury, I was impressed with, obviously I was impressed with the cleanliness, the sort of order, the orderliness of it all. And most importantly, I probably sort of was taken by the Rhodesian accent, because Australian accents can be quite rough and ready at times. And I just thought, my first thought of listening to Rhodesians talk was how posh you all were. So, you know, all very, very high level sort of education. So I was quite surprised by that, but I loved the country straight away. It was, I mean, I arrived, I think it was a Friday afternoon from South Africa, stayed at Meikles over the weekend, the old Meikles building there on the old wing. I think I was paying about $10 a night or something. And then on the Monday morning, I grabbed a Rixie taxi down to KG6 barracks, walked in with my letter of appointment and said, here I am. And about an hour later, I'd gone through a quick, medical, dental, eyesight. Yeah, are you fit and healthy? And I said, well, yeah, I've just come from Australian SAS, and I think I'm reasonably healthy and fit. And they said, okay, fine, welcome to the Rhodesian Army. And an hour later, I was on a Sabre Land Rover being taken down to Cranbourne Barracks. And there I was in a little bed space in the Rhodesian SAS, and wondering what was next. You know, it was great. I enjoyed it straight away. People were very welcoming. I mean, I do remember a couple of days of being there. I'd just been given my uniform, and I was clearly a new, very new uniform, camos and so forth. A couple of guys were walking past me and said, "Oh, here's another one. Looks like there's another one from overseas here." So I thought, well, yeah, there's a welcome. That's but Pete Allen was, I must say, Pete Allen was working was CQMS, I think, at that stage, certainly working in the stores. And when I went in to draw my uniform, I knew I was being welcomed pretty well straight away, and Pete had a bit of a reputation as a gruff and grumpy old bloke. But as I was being given my issue of clothing and so forth, Pete actually gave me all of the SAS Katunda, you know, the wings, the beret, the belt and badge and so forth. And someone in there said, but he hasn't done selection. And he looked at me and said, no, this guy will selection, no problem. So why not give it to him now? Plus, he said I had the right to wear the SAS wings anyway, having training SAS. So I was quite sort of chuffed with that response. You know, I thought, well, you know, people couldn't have been more welcoming. and I had no issues at all.
But you still had to do another. They made you do another selection.
I did, and while I was actually sort of the first few days I was there, I just missed the start of a selection. Another Australian friend of mine who'd come slightly ahead of me, he came back off the selection and just finished it with a couple of other guys and said, welcome and good to see you over here, and I'm sure you'll get through the selection. It's tough, but it's short, So, so I had to hang around for a few weeks, and of course, no one lets young soldiers hang around doing nothing. I ended up doing all sorts of duties, and sort of. I think a few of us actually on the 25-meter range there at Cranmore, and we actually built the butts for that. We had to sort of dig up the soil, and so I kept myself fit and focused while I was doing that, and then the selection, and a lot of the guys who did that, people like sort of Barry Deacon, Baz Jolliffe, who served for a fairly long time after that. They'd come across, they'd done their recruit training over at RLI. At that stage, the SAS didn't do their own recruit training. They got guys from the RLI, and so I was sort of all of a sudden, I was 22 years of age and I was the old guy. Here's all these 18 and 19-year-old guys from RLI having finished their recruit training, fit as fiddles, and I was the old bloke. So it was a good selection. It was down in Oak Crossing in Yanga, and for me. Look, there was a risk, of course, that there was, of course, Frelimo sort of issues along the border still, and it was still Portuguese controlled, of course, but there were concerns. So we were armed and we had ammo as we did the selection. But I do have very vivid memories of walking down from World's View and through Inyanga and walking past Troutbeck and thinking just how beautiful it was there. Of course, the eastern island of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, is world renowned, beautiful, and with blisters and things, I managed to get through the selection, and I was very pleased to have done that. I didn't actually ever think that I would fail it, but I didn't take it lightly. Selections are tough under any circumstances, and attitude counts a lot in a selection. And I didn't want to bring a sort of know-it-all, arrogant attitude to things that I've done this before, and I can do it again. I just sort of set myself as one of the guys within that group, and I might have been a little bit older, but they became good friends, and I was just a part of that selection course.
You came a long way looking for action. Where did you first find it? Do you recall your first contact?
Well, I think my book sort of describes it. My first patrol. Look, I'll jump in here. In between sort of my first job, a friend of mine, Ken Smith, K.R. Smith, had come. He'd actually done the Australian SAS selection with me in '71, and he was the one who first raised Rhodesia with me. He was one of the first to go. And once I'd finished my selection, Ken came up to me and sort of was talking to me in front of the troopies actually, and which was next sergeant's mess, of course, as most of the guys will remember. And we were just chatting away, and he was talking about how much he was enjoying the patrolling, the operations in Mozambique. And how much I would sort of settle into it, and enjoy it. And shortly after that, he deployed and he was killed. He stepped on a landmine and came back was taken back to Andrew Fleming Hospital and died in intensive care within a day or two. So I all of a sudden had to sort of slap across the face about war is hell. It's not a game. So that was my first introduction to the loss of a friend, and it didn't deter me in any way. Of course, it just made me crystallize the fact that war is not a game. I think that was probably the first sort of reminder I had that yeah, this is a you can nothing's going to come easy. But I deployed with Don Kenny actually, and we went up to Kariba. Was my first stop. I remember it quite clearly. We were next to Chetty Island, which is quite a big island there, and we were on a small, pretty much anonymous speck of land, a little island there, and we were there for a couple of weeks waiting for infiltration to come down from Zambia. So nothing happened in that, but you don't know nothing is going to happen, and you're prepared it all day and night. So I got into the swing of it quite well, and I enjoyed it straight away. I did a couple of other things, sort of independently, which, if anyone's interested, is in the book. But the first big op I did was with Chris Schulenberg. Garth Barrett actually was commanding it, of course, and it was the big arms cache in Zambia. Schulenberg had done the recce on that several times. I think he'd been in, and ComOps had given approval to hit that arms cache. It was very big. I was working with Rob Warwicker at the time, who was in charge of the Dems party, the demolitions, and so Rob, myself, and a couple of others, we sort of prepped some charges, shaped charges and things. We weren't sure what we were going to find, and off we went. We crossed the Zambezi on the Zodiacs and put foot on Zambian soil for me the first time, and off we went. And a day and a half later, I think we walked that night. The rest of the next day, I think, was the night, and we actually reached the area, the target. Chris went out and did his final reconnaissance while the call signs, the stop signs were placed and positioned, and then at first light, I think it was Chris Schulenberg who yelled out it was his gig, obviously. I think it was him who yelled out to them to surrender, and that was met with some fire, of course, from the Zipper guys, and of course the SAS retaliated with a blanket of fire, and so that was my first experience. I actually had nailed a guy as he came running down the river, and then we moved into the arms cache, and Rob and I and the other guys, can't remember who they were now, placed the charges, and we blew this thing up, and it was forever after known as the Big Bang, because that's exactly what it was. It was a very, very big bang, and we destroyed a huge amount of arms material in situ. Bit distressing, of course, at the time that we couldn't salvage a lot of that, but it was a deniable operation, so we didn't have helicopters. And what we could carry out was what we carried out, So, but sadly enough, I mean, we were cock a hoop about that, and got back to the Zambezi to be told that our rear base, or our forward base, as it was in Rhodesia, had been hit the night before, the night of the day we hit the arms cache, Dudley, Coventry, and I think one other guy, Willie Erasmus, have both been wounded. Both have been carried back to Salisbury, and I saw Willie afterwards. I think he got shot in the hand. Was probably his worst injury. And Dudley was seriously wounded, but recovered. So that was my first year in Rhodesia. It was very interesting and very exciting, and I got to know, and I became very much a part of the Sea Squadron then. I wasn't seen as another Australian. I was seen as John Gartner, and someone they could trust. It was proving that I was committed to the cause. Because during this period, there were a number of foreigners who were coming and going, of course, and it was a little bit sort of irritating and quite embarrassing sometimes to be asked on parade, well, has anybody seen so-and-so? And on a Monday morning, and it all looked to me and say, well, he's an Aussie, where is he? And I'd say, well, no, it had nothing to do with me. So guys would come and go. They I don't know why. After all these years, I've never really sort of worked out why. I thought, what people went to Rhodesia for, particularly trained soldiers, was there in spades, and to have them leave was a little bit disappointment. But I'd settled well, and I'd got, I've been married now nearly 40 years, and I met my young Rhodesian girlfriend then. In 75, I started taking her out. We got married in 76, so I already had roots into the community, into the country, and those roots went deeper as we had our first child and ultimately second. So, I was very happy in Rhodesia. Home for me, I consider it more my home than Australia. And then, just a lovely country.
Yeah, well, I think Australians and Rhodesians actually had a hell of a lot in common at the end of the day.
Yeah, so yeah, they did.
There was a nice, easy mix, John. John, talk now about your move from the SAS to the Selous Scouts, and a bit about your time in the Scouts.
Okay. I was probably getting late, towards the end of 76. I was getting quite frazzled. It's sort of 75, 76, quite busy periods. It's quite an intense time, and Mick Graham had sort of pushed on some pre-fall ops. So I was working with Andy Chape, Frank Viviers, and so forth on some halo insertions, and halo in those days was pretty rudimentary. We had an oxygen bottle in the aircraft with snaking hoses to our individually. So, and we had no night lights. We had very little in the way of equipment. And I did three op jumps quite quickly, one after the other. The first one I actually got separated in the air. I was fortunate to, and that was with Andy Chait. I cracked my ribs on an operational jump only weeks earlier when we jumped into Mozambique to a camp there, and so I had difficulty getting a stable position when I was free falling, and I lost sight of Andy and the other two guys in the patrol. So I landed on my own. It was nighttime, and I don't know where the hell I was, but luckily I had the radio, the TL48, and I called Bob McKenzie the next morning, and through sort of VHF comms back to the border, Andy wandered along and found me and dragged me back. I did a few of those things, and I was starting to get a bit frazzled by that. So I was due out of the army in March '77 out of C Squad, and I didn't know then at that stage whether I would re-engage. I didn't ever think of leaving Rhodesia permanently, but I knew my wife. I wanted to introduce my wife to my family in Australia, and we were young, and we had one child then. She was a toddler. But in the weeks leading up to me, and I'm pretty sure it was early '77. I remember Chris Schulenberg came into the barracks and said, "John, I'm looking for a guy to come and do a recce with me." And I thought, well, okay, fine, 4-man stuff. That's what we did in the SAS. And it turned out to be a 2-man recce, and that was, and I was happy to do it. Chris and I chopped it in, I think, from Motoko across the border into Mozambique. And in fact, I saw Chris at the Selous Scouts 40th anniversary get together, and I think it was 2015 in Joburg. And he raised the story then. He actually presented the story to the table. And when we got off the chopper and we sort of settled and looked around and we were about to leave, Chris realized he'd left his webbing behind. So he had no compass, and the magazine on his rifle was the only one he had. So reconnaissance discretion was very paramount that day. So we did a few days and got choppered out. And essentially, I think that was my last op in SAS. But it opened the idea of the 2-man concept. I liked it. I think the individuality of it all sort of appealed to me. So my wife Cass and I flew back to Australia for 3 months, but we were keen to get back. And in July, I think it was about July '77, we flew back to Rhodesia after 3 months at Adelaide, and which was nice to be home, but a little bit boring. And I caught up with a number of the guys at Meekles again, and in the front bar there at on the square, and had a few drinks. And I was chatting to them, and they were saying, come on back into C Squadron. I thought, yeah, this is a good idea. But as I was sort of walking across the square to the Rixie taxis to go out to KG6 to re-engage, I ran into John Murphy. John Murphy heard I was in town and came looking for me. Wasn't hard to find in Salisbury in those days. Weren't many places you could hide away there. And then he accosted me and said, "Look, I'm out at Selous Scouts now. There's some guys out there. Chris is there. They're working for a good guy called Neil Creel, who you haven't met yet, but he's a great guy and a major, and they're looking for some guys to take on the recce role, a small team recce role. So come along. Ron Day would love to talk to you." So that's exactly what I did, and I met Ron, and I met Neil, and they both said, "We'd love to have you. You come. Chris and knows you, and it'll be a good thing to have you." And within a day or so, I was attested back into the army, and I was a Selous Scout. So I guess it was fortuitous at the time, because Chris and Tim were both down in Simonstown on a diving course. So Neil had no white recce team commanders. He had Stephen and Martin, the two operators who worked with. Along comes John Gartner. So I RV'd with Neil at the drill hall in Salisbury, and he drove me down to Cherezi. We ended up at Buffalo Range, and there was Bert Sachs and Stephen and Martin and Dennis Crowcamp and a few others, a few of the TA Selous Scout. And Neil said, "There you go, John. You're on your own. Find your way. Bert will sort of assist you in whatever needs to be done." So I chatted to Bert, and he said, "Well, you probably want to familiarise yourself. You've been out of the field for a few months." So I did a short job with quite a large group, which was run by Dennis Crowcamp, TAs, and we brought Stephen and Martin along to make up the numbers, and it also gave me a chance to work with them in the field. We chopped it into the fence, up to the border fence, and then crossed into Mozambique. We did our thing for 5 or 7 days, whatever. And then we came back, and I liked both Martin and Stephen, but they were both at loose ends with Chris and Tim away. I said to Steve, I liked Stephen's sense of humour. He was a little bit older. He was easier to sort of talk to. Martin was very good, but you know, a little bit more aloof. And so Stephen was
your first experience of working with black soldiers.
Yeah, it was. And it was, yeah. So you know, I said to Stephen, look, I could have said to Stephen, you're working with me, but I didn't want to put it like that. So I said, look, I would like to work with you if you'd like to work with me. I think we could make a good team, at least until Chris comes back. And he said, no, that's fine, John. Like the way you operated, and you've come from Sea Squadron, so we know you've been around a bit. So, and I think what sort of I think solidified it and closed the deal was Stephen had been there when he was with Chris. He always carried the TL-48, which is a bloody heavy radio, as you can imagine. And I said to him, well, no, I'm the signaller. I do the signal, so it's my job to carry the radio. So he was very tough with that. And I said, but you will carry the spare battery. I mean, my Morse was excellent, and I always liked to know that, you know, I was doing the radio comms, so it was my responsibility to carry that radio. So, and we struck up a deal, and that was the role. You know, he would carry the, you know, anything extra patrol equipment that I couldn't fit in, and I would carry the radio and do all of the communications, and it worked well.
And two-man recce's with Stephen and Porful.
Yeah. Okay. Stephen was very, very good, very confident. And the first deployment we did, Ron had sort of briefed us that there was a major arms cache, probably about 20 odd Ks into Mozambique. It was hot. You can imagine that time of the year. This is like August, 77, very hot, very dry. We were south of the Sabi. We deployed south of the Sabi, and essentially between the Sabi and the Limpopo. So we were in that dry area in between. So we chopped it into the fence line, crossed over, and we went looking for this arms cache, which we had pretty good idea where it was. It was on a small tributary to the Sabi. So we spent a few days moving in slowly and surely, and lo and behold, you know, it was a tough task because it was so hot and it was so dry, and we had to loop back to the Sabi every, you know, to get water after about 2 days because we were dehydrating quite badly. But there we were in the morning of, I think, about the 5th day. We knew we were very close, and we were slowly working our way through sort of a thorny bush type part of the territory there. And Stephen stopped. He was ahead. He stopped in his tracks and sort of put his hand up very slowly. And I was probably about 5 meters behind him. And I stopped and I looked around and made sure nothing was coming up our way. And Stephen slowly turned and sort of gave me the thumbs down, and we sort of walked back away, probably 100 or so meters, and said to me, "Oh, they're just there in front of us. You know, they were on the river. They were about 30 or 40, maybe 50, who knows? Quite a large grouping. They were all sort of casual. They didn't expect that to see us, and they never saw Stephen. So because we were still in the bush, so." Stephen said, "Let's call in an airstrike." Chris would bring in an airstrike straight away. I said, "Well, let's hang on a little bit. I want to see what we can do." And so we reported back to Bert, and Ron gave us instruction to come back. We walked back to the border that very night, actually, and crossed the Sabi, and came back into Rhodesia. Ron arranged for us to be picked up, and he was actually in Buffalo Range when we got back to port. I briefed him, and they sent in an airstrike the next day, and then they followed up with some troops on the ground and quite a large arms cache. So we were very tough with that. It wasn't probably sort of, you know, a well coordinated thing. I think Ron just wanted to hammer the arms cache, and that's what he did, you know. So arranged with the Air Force to go in and bomb it, and Steve and I were very, very pleased with that, and that's how we worked when Chris came back. And I'm hoping it was Stephen wanted to stay with me because he thought I was a better soldier than Chris, but probably because I was carrying the radio, he decided to go back to carrying that heavy radio. But anyway, when Chris came back, Stephen said to me, I want to stay with you, and if that's all right with you. And I said, yeah, absolutely. We spoke to Neil and Chris, and Chris was very understanding. He said, no problems. Seemed to be working well together. There was no ego. I like Chris from that, you know, and then Stephen and I carried on working for probably another year or so, until I moved off onto other projects and different techniques. Neil was a very innovative commander. He had a lot of good ideas. I had a great deal of respect for Neil Krill. And also Ron Reed Daly was a superb. Again, if he'd been an entrepreneur in business, he would have made millions of dollars, because he was just a man who could see the sort of the opportunities that other people perhaps didn't quite see very well. So with Mac McGuinness from Special Branch up at Bindura, and Ron and I sat down. Neil was there, and I had an Australian passport, so they sent me. Mike Borlase had been deployed separately into Lusaka.
Yeah.
There were one or two other guys up that way. Mike, of course, I'm not disclosing any secrets. Of course, he was captured by the Zambians and imprisoned and but before that happened, I was deployed. I ended up driving a heavy truck up through Botswana, out of Bulawayo. Actually, I picked up the truck from Bulawayo through Francistown, and through Plumtree into Botswana, across to Francistown, and then up across to Kazangula on the ferry.
Just tell
through
us,
Lusaka and all.
What was your task when you went under?
The task was essentially, they believe that there are a lot of camps along the Great East Road, east out of, which is true, of course there were, around that area, south of that Great East Road between, which ran from Lusaka to Lilongwe in Malawi, and essentially just to drive along there, become familiar with the route, and wherever I saw concentrations of guys who perhaps shouldn't have been there, which I did see actually, you would see them sitting under trees and so forth along the road, just to sort of drive and identify sort of, more or less where things were, and really just to build a sort of a cover. I don't know how well I did that, to tell the truth, because I was still bearded, and I remember the first time I drove into Lusaka, to the forecourt of a service station there to refuel, having come up from Kazangula, Livingston. I was standing there sort of filling my tank, and some people were around me speaking whatever they speak in Lusaka, and I could hear this sort of skuzapu thing, which was and they were laughing about it. Now, I wasn't supposed to know what that was, of course, so I couldn't respond to it, but it tweaked my ear, and I had to my heart started beating a little bit faster, but I think they were just saying, because this guy was bearded, he could very well have been a skuzapu, a salute scout, which they knew I probably wasn't, because I was standing there in the forecourt in Lusaka, but it did sort of set my heart beating for a little bit. So they were very conscious in Zambia. If you came up from the south, you were either a Rhodesian spy or a South African spy, if you were white, So my Australian accent always got very, very strong when I was in these places, and I played the innocent tourist, and telling people I was working my way around Africa, and I got away with it for a while at least. But so getting all the way, I did have my first bad incident at Kafue Bridge on the way to Lilongwe. And then, but the Zambian army position, drugged up, and so they reeked of booze, and they were very, very rude to me. I was a white guy in the middle of nowhere. You can't really do much, so you just have to take it. And I was asked to, very nicely, as you can imagine, to take one of them to the Zambian border. So I had a passenger, an unwelcome passenger, who slept most of the way there. But it made it a little bit easier for me at subsequent Zambian army checkpoints, because I'm obviously a nice guy, giving one of their number a lift to the border. So, you play the game.
So, John, where were you when the war finished? Were you external on your covert operations?
When the war finished, when Ron left, I got compromised, apparently. When Mike Borlase got compromised, obviously the cat amongst the pigeons there in Salisbury, and there were all the stories of betrayals and traitors and so forth, and I'd done a couple of those deployments up to Zambia, up to the previous trip, and so forth, and I said to Ron, I'd like to get back. I think we need to look at helping get Mike out, and Ron said, look, I think you've been compromised. Mac's telling us that there's a bit of an issue about you, and we're not sure, and so we'd rather you don't go back. And as it turned out, apparently I was, because some weeks, maybe months even later, Mac McGuinness sort of gave me a copy of a clipping from a Zambian newspaper, where a guy called Michael Gardner, an American, had been arrested in Livingston, and they beat the hell out of him because they accused him of being a Rhodesian spy. And how it came to the press's notice was he had complained to the US ambassador, because he'd been released eventually. after his mistreatment in Livingston. And he had complained officially to the US ambassador in Lusaka, and it created a little bit of controversy at the time. Now, because of my, I'm John Gartner, but my passport shows me as Malcolm John Gartner. So Max said, look, they were looking for M. Gartner, and they picked up Michael Gardner. So we think that was you. So they were probably wise enough to say, stop me being headstrong and going in. So I went back to the recce role with Stephen, and we and Andre mentioned it in the second one. He went into recce the Nichamoya, and he got compromised there and got chased out. And he can tell a story better than me, but I knew that there'd been an SAS call sign had been compromised, and Ron Reed Daly deployed me with Stephen to go in, and we did, and we were very stealthy. We were very good pair in the bush. Our bush skills were very good, but we didn't realise, because we had the air photo run of the actual camp. And the numbers varied. I was told in there from 2,000 to 5,000. Rex Nongo was a regular visitor, Josiah Tonkara. So it was a major camp, and it was probably the biggest one I'd been given the opportunity to reconnoitre. So I was pleased to do it, and Stephen was happy to have me back from my vehicle running around, and off we went. Tim Bax, Neil had left by then, and Tim Bax was running the recce deployment. I deployed out of Grand Reef. And I remember it was in August, because my second daughter, was born while I was just around Mozambique. But we went in. We didn't realise that there were satellite camps south of the main camp, and there was a sort of a regular. We knew there'd be clearance patrols, but we didn't realise it was so far south, because we didn't have the air photo run that went that far south. And it was only when we hit the camp weeks later that I realised just how big that camp did extend. But we went in, we walked through, we were moving towards we were actually trying to get past around south of the camp, and to approach it from the east, thought would be more secure. And 2-man, it's very hard to see. It's hard to find us, and our skills were good. We were pretty professional. But we were walking in the morning. It was quite quite darkish still, but lightening up, and we walked around a sort of a bush, and looking. As we looked forward, there was at least a platoon of Zama soldiers standing in the line of clearance patrol, and they saw us just as we saw them. And we knew who they were. They didn't know who the hell we were, because Stephen was in front and I was just behind him, and we were I was blackened up, of course. So we sort of stared at one another for a little while, and looking back, it was probably only a couple of seconds, but we just sort of looked at one another, and they didn't know who we were, and I knew. So I whispered to Stephen to come back, and he stepped back, and as we sort of, it's almost laughable now as I look back at it. We just sort of turned around and started walking away, and this inspired the guys to start calling out to us, because they probably still thought, we were part of their group. And as we got out of sight, we started legging it, of course, a little bit faster, and then these guys obviously realised that we were the bad guys, and they went into an extended sweep line and started firing into the bush behind us, and we ran like hell after that. And after about an hour, I threw the radio out and the antenna out, and tried to call Grand Reef to get us a hot extraction. Couldn't raise them, so we carried on for the next few hours. Tried a couple of times, but eventually around midday we managed to establish comms with Grand Reef, and Dave Scales, I think, was there at the time as a signaller, maybe Butch Atkins. But Tim was very good, very quick to respond. Sent up a couple of hunters, got in touch with Bello, and we had some hunters in the air to provide us some top cover while they sent in the helicopter and picked us up. So second, the SAS had been compromised, we'd been compromised. So clearly those guys knew that we knew where they were, and they were ready for an attack coming in at them. They knew Rhodesians wouldn't allow them to be at the border. They weren't close to the border, but they were close enough to. So Stephen decided he didn't want to do any more of that sort of work, and that was fine. He was tired, so he referred me to one of his friends, a big Shona guy, and when Ron Reed Daly was tasked with the RLI to strike that camp, and I asked Ron to be involved in that. He said no, got another task to do afterwards. So I went in with Ron into Mozambique and stayed up in his forward headquarters while the strikes and the attack went in. I remember Richard Passaportis was there, predominantly running around with his, a lot of the TA Selous scouts were called up for that particular task, and they would have all jumped at that. And then I joined one of the sweep lines, and we worked up to the top of the Monte Casino, as it was called, and that's where sort of we had a couple of guys. One was killed up there from an explosion from a 30 mm cannon shell, an accident. So I was tasked to stay on with my partner, and we stayed another 5 or 6 days. We took up a position probably sort of 500 meters from the main camp, and we hid ourselves and watched and we saw a lot of guys coming backwards and forwards, and they were all very angry, obviously, Xana guys, but not enough numbers to call an airstrike. So eventually Ron called me back and said, come back, but we can't send a helicopter to pick you up. It's too risky. We've lost a hunter, we've lost a Canberra. They don't want to risk any more aircraft. So I'm in. My partner and I sort of out that night and covered 40 k's. We scooted around the burning camp, still burning camp, and got back to the border and were picked up, exhausted, as you can imagine. But by then, Ron's travails with Hickman had started to sort of cause some problems, and he left, and Pat Armstrong, of course, came in, and this is towards the end of '79, and my last op was with. I mean, we were across the border in Zambia. There were a lot of major operations. RLI was active, Selous Scouts were active, C Squadron was active, Rhodesian SAS by then, I finished my task and was picked up. And it was late mid '79, I guess, and I just thought, I've had enough of this. Lancaster House was well underway. It was clear that there was going to be a solution, and I came back and I went to see Pat Armstrong, and I said, look, the terms of my contract are 30 days notice. I'm giving you that notice. I'll finish at the end of December '79. And he said, no problem. John didn't know me much, hadn't met me before. So I actually resigned, and I sent out a CV to a number of companies. Lonro was the first one to get back to me, and they flew us down, my wife and I, down to Sandawana. We flew down to Sandawana. They offered me the job as security manager down at Sandawana, which I accepted on the spot. And we were supposed to move down for Christmas, but then I got back to Salisbury, and some friends of mine were up working with Mac McGuinness up in Bindura, came down to see me and said, look, Mac's looking for a little bit of sort of operational support from, XSS guys. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah, I would. So I rang Lonro and said, thanks, I've just been called up again. I can't get away from my job. And I went up to Bindura and met with Mac, and he offered me a month-to-month job, doing whatever needed to be done. And lo and behold, who was up there but Neil Creel and Chris Schillerberg. So they were working for South African Special Forces at the time. And that's how my transition from Asia to South Africa was actually so seamless, because immediately my first job for Mac was down in South Africa and across into Botswana, run by Neil Creel, and Chris Schillerberg was on it. So, my transition was quite easy. And I went down to Pretoria. I met with General Fritz Lewitz, who was the GOC Special Forces, and Neil was there. Neil introduced me and said, look, John's interested in joining us at Barnacle, which was the operation out now near Lanseria. And the general said, well, I can give you one of two offers. I can bring you into the army and you'll get the rank structure and so forth, or I can give you an offer of a job through Armaments Corporation, through their Special Operations Division, and I can pay you a lot more money. And I said, well, I'm just newly into South Africa, so clearly the money counts more to me than rank. So, and I don't like uniforms anyway. So within weeks, I was offered the job. I signed the contract, and Neil was very efficient again. As I said, Special Forces was very efficient, and I got my permanent residency very quickly. So I relocated to South Africa in early '80, and that's where it was. I didn't end my involvement with Zimbabwe because, of course, South Africa sent me back into Zimbabwe after independence, and I did some time there until I was eventually compromised in Bulawayo, and Neil flew me out. Neil rescued me and my wife and children from a farm airstrip. Won't say where. It's in the book. But they flew in low level, picked me up, and flew me back to South Africa with my wife and children, and that was in late '81. out of just near Wanda, actually, near Strictly Wanda, and down into Messina. We landed there. We had a good chat. We flew back to Pretoria to land Syria, and I've never been back in Zimbabwe ever since. That's the last of it for me. 81.
Well, John, you certainly did your bit for a country that wasn't yours.
Yeah.
Hell of a story, and I know it carries on. You've done a lot since then, but maybe we can talk about that at another time.
Sure, no problem.